Let's take a look at the Russian defenses and what Ukraine could be up against as their offensive continues. Most of the fighting across the front is either at or recently breached the first line of Russian defenses. And over the last year or so, Russia has built up a pretty significant defense in depth that the Center for Strategic and International Studies recently called the most extensive defensive works in Europe since World War II. Rather than go big picture and talk in generalities, I thought it'd be helpful to dial into one specific area of the battlefield to show exactly how these defenses are set up. There's a few good resources that came out recently that I'm going to rely pretty heavily on here. The first is the Twitter thread by Emil Castahelmi of the Blackbird Group, and the second, a recent piece by CSIS on the overall Russian defense. The area we're going to look at is around Mykolivka, which is around 30 kilometers behind the front right now and would be in Ukraine's path should they push on towards Melitopol. Now, this general Zaporozhye area to the south looks to be the most heavily defended of all Russian territory right now. And if you look at the concentration of defensive positions put together here by Brady Afric, you can see how the general area between Zaporozhye and Melitopol is just dense. There's a little debate about what to call each one of these lines. I mean, in Castahelmi's analysis, he focuses in on what he calls the second line of defense, specifically around this area here. I'm taking that to mean that he views the very front line as more skirmishing positions and minefields than any sort of set defensive position. I just want to clear that up because I probably would call what we're looking at here the third line. He calls it the second. Overall, it doesn't really matter. We're going to look at what it's made up of. Here's a big picture view of the area we're going to look at, and we'll dial into a few features as I talk through. All right, so diving in, the first major feature called out here is an anti-tank ditch nearly 50 kilometers long running all the way from the Dnieper River to Tokmak. These tank ditches are generally 10 to 12 feet wide and 6 or more feet deep. It's a pretty rudimentary means of stopping vehicles, but it does the trick. I mean, for Ukraine or really any military to cross over these anti-tank ditches usually requires some sort of bridging equipment. The benefit there to the defending force is that even if a lane is opened, it funnels advancing vehicles into a few key crossing points rather than being able to attack across a wide front. Then just behind the ditch, you have what appear to be 3 rows of dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles. Again, pretty simple obstacle that can help to blunt an offensive. We have seen some imagery of these not being anchored into the ground and falling apart at times, but I'd be hesitant to assume that that applies all across the front. Maybe it does, but I don't think that's something that Ukraine is going to want to base their offensive off of. The way these work is that they're placed in close enough proximity to one another to where wheeled vehicles can't drive between them and they don't have enough power to move them aside. Then when it comes to tracked vehicles like tanks, given the shape of these dragon's teeth, if the tank tries to push through, it's at risk of riding up and tipping over. There are means to drag or push these out of the way, but similar to the anti-tank ditch, that funnels an attacking force into a few select areas, which makes the overall defense that much easier. In terms of breaching through these dragon's teeth obstacles, Mykolaiv might do the trick. Of course, you'd have to get relatively close for that to be effective. It really isn't an ideal target for any sort of mortars, artillery, or long-range fires. It's just the volume of shells that would be needed to, maybe destroy some of these concrete blocks would leave a massive amount of craters, churned up earth, and debris all around this one area to where it could be even harder to pass through than if they hadn't tried that at all. This portion of the defensive line, of course, includes fighting positions, and here they appear to be a little better built than some more forward locations, which makes sense. I mean, while this area is within range of long-range Ukrainian fires, for the most part, these construction crews have been able to operate pretty safely for quite a while now. Even if Ukraine had doubled or tripled the quantity of precision long-range munitions, hitting an engineer company building a fighting position 30 kilometers back from the front isn't a realistic priority target. Maybe it is now or as they advance, but not during construction. That means that most of the trenches in this area likely have some deeper reinforced areas for command posts as well as overhead cover for the majority of their fighting positions. Since Russia had time to set these in place, you can also expect that the units manning these positions have had time to plan artillery and mortar fire in their sector and have set up direct fire weapon systems to cover likely avenues of attack. Then behind this trench line, we see another anti-tank ditch and a series of dragon's teeth. Behind those are vehicle fighting positions, so think BMPs or tanks set up in a location where they can engage any breaching force with direct fire. There's also a bit of a cleared path, if we zoom in to a few of these areas, between the vehicle fighting positions and into this zone near the trenches. So if needed, vehicles could move forward into some sort of local counterattack. Now, I wouldn't expect those to be the same vehicles that are providing fire support. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the vehicles dug in are older tanks and BMPs, maybe even with some sort of maintenance issues, essentially serving as more static fighting positions. It's just that a really easy use for any sort of damaged equipment is in this sort of defensive posture. In turn, that would free up some of Russia's more modern tanks and assault vehicles to serve as a more mobile reserve, pushing forward when needed. So how can Ukraine deal with this? Bottom line, from what we see here and stories coming out of the fighting already, these are pretty serious defensive setups, and the best way to defeat a defense in depth is to go around it. Not sure if that's a viable option for Ukraine, so if they do intend on taking these defensive positions head on, I would expect to see a concentration of long-range precision strikes against some of these areas in the hours leading up to an assault. I'm talking about a very heavy concentration of fires that destroys the vehicle overwatch positions and at the very least causes some pretty serious damage to the trench systems. Those strikes aren't going to do anything to the Dragon's Teeth, the minefields, or the anti-tank ditches, but it could provide some sort of short-term breathing room for a breaching force to move forward. And overall, getting through any defensive setup is possible, but in this case, it's going to take a very well-executed operation. We've got a few areas to look at in terms of battlefield updates in Ukraine. Over the last few days, Russia has initiated offensive operations around Kupiansk and Liman, and Ukraine has made progress in the south around Robotyne. I'm going to zero in on those areas because that's what's changed, but it's worth noting that the fighting is still ongoing all across the front. Overall, Ukraine is on the offensive around Orikhiv, Velka Novosilka, and Bakhmut, while Russia has pushed local counterattacks at each of those areas, as well as Marinka and Avdiivka. Starting with the Russian attack up north. So it's believed that this is designed to reduce the pressure on the Ukrainian offensive further south, forcing Ukraine to reallocate resources to prevent any sort of breakthrough around Kupiansk or Liman. According to Bakhmut Demon, a Ukrainian fighter now on that front, all Russian attacks so far have seen minimal progress. He says that everything to this point has been able to be stopped with local resources, nothing having to be moved from Bakhmut, and that Russian progress is being measured in tens or hundreds of meters. This generally tracks with what I've seen out of Russian media over the last few days. Right away, there was some speculation that Russia had achieved some sort of major breakthrough and was on the outskirts of Kupiansk already, but that appears to have been just a little bit exaggerated. I mean, even pro-Russian sources are now talking about it more as just an uptick in fighting and really aren't talking about serious territorial gains. Now, I have seen this map floating around on a handful of Russian channels showing progress in that Kupiansk area. For reference, what you're seeing here would be an advance of 4 to 6 kilometers and leave Russia right on the outskirts of Kupiansk itself. Again, my gut says that this is just a little bit exaggerated. I'm just not seeing the hype you would expect and that we've seen in the past from Russian channels if an advance like this was accurate. Ukraine has reported progress towards Robotyne in the Orikhiv direction. Now, Deep State Map was pretty quick to make this adjustment, showing an estimated 12 square kilometers taken in the past day or so. But this is another one with pretty mixed signals right now. This map is from a Russian channel showing Ukrainian progress in that area, but is accompanied with commentary from a Russian soldier saying that the attackers, the Ukrainians, suffered heavy losses and failed to gain any territory. So just like any other area that's seen a concerted attack over the last few weeks, the initial reports are messy and a clear picture has yet to emerge. The popular website Oryx has announced that they will be ceasing operations on October 1st. The site, which has been run by the same group over the last 10 years, gained quite a bit of attention early in this war as kind of the go-to site for verified losses of Ukrainian and Russian equipment. Of course, having started 10 years ago, Oryx's focus initially was not on Russia and Ukraine. That's really what's gotten them a lot of attention over the last couple of years. So much so that even government officials and major news outlets often reference their statistics to try to understand the scope of the losses in this war. And over time, they branched out, documenting military aid sent to Ukraine, broken out by what each country has promised and delivered. I don't know if you've spent much time on that site, but the amount of work those guys put into these lists is just incredible. They focused on only listing equipment losses that could be verified with images or videos and linked that evidence to each claim. Now, it's a little overwhelming to think of how much media they had to sift through, especially in some of those early days, to determine if it's the same tank or just from a different angle or a different vehicle altogether. Then in a blog post on June 21st, the group said that spending all of their free time building these lists just doesn't make them happy anymore, so they're going to be stepping away. Now, if you're looking for a resource to kind of fill that gap of tracking equipment losses in the war, War Spotting seems to be doing a pretty good job. Now, they track things a little bit differently if it's a low quality image or video. rather than guess as to the type of equipment. They don't include that one at all. They also only track destroyed, not really looking at damaged, captured, or abandoned. So overall, their numbers are going to be quite a bit different than Oryx, but it's another place to look. Cluster munitions are a pretty touchy subject. It's one of those things where if war was fought entirely in a vacuum, it'd be a no-brainer to use these things. I mean, they are pretty effective, but war is not fought in a vacuum. And if there aren't civilians nearby now, there likely will be in the future. And this is something that can cause a lot of serious injury or death long after the fighting has stopped. The controversy over these weapons, which release smaller submunitions over a large area, led to the 2008 Convention on Cluster Munitions that prohibits the use, stockpiling, or transfer of this type of weapon. Over 100 nations have signed that treaty, but for the sake of this topic here, Russia, the United States, and Ukraine have not. The U.S. military recently came out and said that cluster munitions, specifically DPICM, or dual-purpose improved conventional munitions, would be valuable to Ukraine in their current fight with Russia. These are a type of cluster munition that contain a mixture of anti-tank and anti-personnel submunitions. Usually this takes the form of a bomblet built around a shape charge with increased fragmentation. After being released from the larger munition, the bomblet falls under a ribbon, stabilizing its flight. It's designed to detonate on impact, at which point the shape charge is directed downward, with shrapnel being sent out in a circular pattern. And even if we look at the smaller 105 millimeter variants, these contain 42 different bomblets, so they tend to be scattered over a pretty wide area. Some of the newer variations, those built in the 1990s, also come with a self-destruct mechanism set to go off after 7 minutes, which, you know, it's something. It helps, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee that these won't remain lethal for years or even decades to come. So think of the impact that these would have being fired over a Russian trench. I mean, a quick fire mission of just 8 105 millimeter DPICM rounds could blanket a section of the Russian line with 336 bomblets, all detonating within just a few minutes. I've heard some folks say that there's a U.S. law prohibiting the sale or transfer of these weapons, but I haven't seen that. And the U.S. was recently providing Saudi Arabia with cluster munitions for their war in Yemen before stopping that transfer in 2016. So it's been done before and relatively recently. My personal opinion is that Ukraine is the party that assumes the risk here. It's their citizens who will have to deal with unexploded ordnance across the battlefields after this war, not us. So if that's an acceptable risk in their eyes for what it'll accomplish, I think it should at least be considered. Lastly, I don't really like the argument that because Russia did something, then it's okay for others to do. I personally still think there's some value in trying to hold the moral high ground, really in any conflict. It's worth noting here that Russia has and continues to use a variety of cluster and incendiary munitions all across the battlefield. So if the United States were to send cluster munitions to Ukraine, it's not as though that would be the introduction of that weapon to this war. But that's all I got for now. Be sure to check out the national security sit reps I put out on Substack. If interested, the link is in the description below. But thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.